for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little black subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that black subscribe button. Really does help our audience grow, really does help our channel grow, really does help and mean more than you could possibly know. So go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Also, thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet 50 on any game, get $250 in free bets. Thank you again to Betfred. Thank you again to you. Now, here's the video that you came here for. Really quickly, there was another Dan Hurley story that many of you guys sent me outside of the contract extension. There was a very interesting Dan Hurley story that many of you guys have passed on to me over the last couple days that I do just want to quickly address over, the next 4 or 5 minutes or so, because boy, oh boy, was it interesting. And it was interesting because of some comments he made that may or may not have been directed at John Calipari. And for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, and many of you maybe don't, so Dan Hurley and UConn's coaches were at one of these kind of, midsummer booster events. If you remember a year ago, this is where Nick Saban kind of went after Jimbo Fisher. It was one of those road tour caravan things where you get a bunch of boosters together. The fans are all drinking. You're trying to get them to have a good time, donate a little bit of money, rile them up, get them excited. Well, UConn had one earlier this week. Jim Moore was there. Dan Hurley was there. I believe Jim Penders, the baseball coach, and Chris Daly, the women's assistant basketball coach, Gino Auriemma's number 2, was there as well. Conversation gets going, and one of the questions that Dan Hurley is asked is about the NBA draft. And so he made a very interesting comment about where he planned to be on Thursday night as it pertained to Jordan Hawkins, who, of course, was in the green room on Thursday. So Dan Hurley basically talking about the opportunity to be in the green room with Jordan Hawkins. Here is what Dan Hurley had to say per Dave Borges, one of the UConn beat writers. Dan Hurley said this. He said, "We don't have all these banners on the wall because of players that came in as the number 1 player in the country and then left as the number 1 pick, and you basically babysat them for 6 months. We've been able to do it with players who coming in were not considered early entry or even NBA players at all. I think smart people recognize that you're improving and that player development is a real thing." So let me read that first part again. We don't have all these banners on the wall because of players that came in as the number 1 player in the country and then left as the number 1 pick, and you basically babysat them for 6 months. I bring it up. Some UConn fans sent me it. Some Kentucky fans sent me it. And many of you asked me one simple question. Torres, did your boy Dan Hurley just take a shot at John Calipari? And let me just say this. First of all, on the one hand, I can see where it would be perceived that way. And specifically about Calipari, right? Because at this point, yes, Duke is recruiting really, really, really well. But with Coach K retiring, Calipari has kind of reestablished himself. He's the guy. I want to build through elite freshmen. I'm going to do it the way that has worked for me rather than go the veteran route, the portal route, the 3-4 year guy route. So I can see where people would perceive that it was a shot at John Calipari. Now, I don't necessarily believe that it was, and let me explain why. One, it's not really how Dan Hurley operates, and I don't claim to know Dan Hurley. I've been in press conferences with him. I haven't really spent much time one-on-one with him. But one thing that has really impressed me about him, he does a great job of blocking out noise, blocking out what everybody else is talking about. He really doesn't care how Villanova is running their program or how Kentucky is running their program or Syracuse is running their program or Georgetown or Duke or North Carolina. I don't think he really cares. I think what he's saying is what works for us, works for us. What works for them, works for them. I don't really care what everybody else is doing. And beyond that, I don't really think it was a shot at anybody else. I would add, I don't believe that John Calipari, even though he has had a couple disappointing seasons, I don't believe he babysits anybody. Guys come in, guys get better, guys develop under his watch. As I've said many times, a lot of his best players were not can't-miss elite players. Devin Booker was not a perceived one-and-done when he committed to Kentucky. Tyler Hero was not a perceived one-and-done when he committed to Kentucky. So you go on and on down the list. One, I don't think Hurley was going after Calipari. And two, I don't think Calipari babysits anybody. Three, What I really think it was, to be perfectly honest, do you know what I think it was? I think it was Dan Hurley saying, we're doing something really special here at UConn, and you all need to pay attention. We are, and I truly believe this, and now I'm talking me as Aaron Torres, not me as paraphrasing Dan Hurley. I think you can already argue that Dan Hurley is maybe the best talent evaluator and developer in college basketball. It sounds crazy, but hear me out. Because remember, he took over a program that was coming off back-to-back losing seasons in the AAC. Here is what he has done in his short time at UConn. I'm just going to give you a few names. James Bouknight, UConn fans remember that, was the 66th ranked player in his high school class. He ended up being a lottery pick after 2 years at UConn under Dan Hurley in 2021. Tyrese Martin was ranked 226th in his high school class. He ends up committing to Dan Hurley at Rhode Island. He ends up transferring to UConn. He plays 2 years at UConn. How about this? He was the only player from the Big East, the entire Big East, Villanova, Providence, Georgetown, whomever, that was drafted in the 2022 NBA draft. So 226th in his high school class to being drafted a few years later after playing for Dan Hurley. Jordan Hawkins, 51st ranked player in his class. We know what happened the other night. Jordan Hawkins, by the way, crazy story, had never even visited UConn before enrolling. Basically, his junior year kind of coincided with COVID. He couldn't travel. He couldn't visit. He couldn't do this. He couldn't do that. That was probably why he was a little bit underrated. 51st in the country. It's clear he wasn't the 51st best player. Oh, by the way, Donovan Clingan, who I believe will be a top probably 10 to 15 pick next year, was 56th in his class, and I believe is a future first rounder. And so you look at Dan Hurley's track record, and oh, by the way, I'm not even going to include an Andre Jackson, who was ranked number 51 in his final recruiting class by 24/7 Sports. He is a guy that obviously is going to be in the NBA for a very long time. So I don't believe that this was a shot at anybody, specifically John Calipari. I think what Dan Hurley was saying was this, is that, listen, I've only been here 5 years, and we already got a natty. We already got some banners on the wall, and I'm doing it the old school way. I am developing NBA players. And it's not just Kentucky, by the way. It's Duke. It's anybody who brings in these one and dones, and a year later they're gone. That's not who we are. That's not what we're about. And what I believe Dan Hurley is trying to say is, like, if we offer you a scholarship, that should mean something to you, because that means that we believe you are an NBA player. We believe that you have NBA talent, even if maybe the evaluators don't see it, if the other recruiters don't see it, if other schools aren't offering you. If we think you're good enough to play here, we think you're good enough to play in the NBA. Lastly, I would just say this. It will be interesting to see if we start to get more of this, because the one thing I can kind of tell you from the UConn psyche is that, listen, what was the conversation after the Final Four? It was, is UConn a blue blood? Is UConn a historically great program? And I do think there's that little chip on the shoulder, East Coast, Northeast thing, not only from Dan Hurley, but from the entire UConn fan base. I include myself, because I never think UConn gets enough credit on the national landscape. And that dates back to Jim Calhoun. Now, if Jim Calhoun had said this, I absolutely believe he would have been taking a shot at somebody. And the old adage about Jim Calhoun was he actually took a lot of pride in what Dan Hurley was talking about. He used to love to get the players that the Dukes and the Carolinas didn't want, and then beat Duke and Carolina with them. By the way, Jim Calhoun took 2 national championships away from Coach K, beating him in the 99 title game, beating him in 04 in the Final Four with my buddy JJ Redick. But I just bring it up because I look at these quotes. They're very interesting. Again, I had Kentucky fans reach out. I had UConn fans reach out. But when I look at them, I don't see a coach trying to go after another program, trying to take another shot, trying to do this, trying to do that. I actually see a coach that's trying to promote his program much more than take shots at anybody else.